So Stephanie, let's go over. I mean, this. Just give me your I guess your very general assessment of this tax bill as tax reform. I mean, and perhaps like let's set tax reform in terms of like what that means as a goal. That it means to make the tax system more efficient, to make it more efficient in achieving certain goals. Those goals may be different, or how one gets there may be different between Republicans and Democrats. But broadly speaking, as just sort of a piece of legislation, give me your assessment of this bill.
Well, okay, so I would say first that this is not what any Republican has had in mind for many years as they talk about the goal being tax reform, as you said, coming up with a smarter, more efficient way to allow Americans to file their taxes. They used to talk about doing things like closing loopholes and that sort of thing. This is what tax reform was supposed to look like. What the Trump administration clearly had in mind, though, was something much quicker and dirtier. And so while Donald Trump would often talk about tax reform, he always put or cuts in each tweet, because at the end of the day, that's what Donald Trump's goal was. And I think what we're seeing is that's been the goal for Republicans as well. They're satisfied with a quick win that does less of the kinds of things that they traditionally talked about wanting to do when it came to reforming the tax code, which is a massive thing, right? It would take a very deliberative process and probably a number of years if you were going to go through the tax code and do real tax reform. What
Right.
they have decided to settle for instead is a very quickly cobbled together hodgepodge of mostly tax cuts aimed obviously mostly for corporations and those at the top of the income spectrum.
Now, there's some fairly arcane rules in the Senate that will allow the Republicans to pass it there by only a simple majority. In other words, a filibuster is disallowed in this circumstance. It is called a reconciliation process. It also, it obviously has implications in terms of their ability to pass this. Give us a sense of like what the main restrictions are on this tax bill for them to be allowed to do this, because those restrictions in many ways are forming the substance of this bill more than any type of deep thought as to how this is going to impact the country.
That's right. So what they're trying to do is to get this thing through on probably a straight party line vote where they don't have to get to the 60 vote threshold. So they do it in a process called budget reconciliation. And so we don't actually have, people are talking about the tax bill. We don't really have the tax bill. We have a House version, we have a Senate version, and the idea is that both bodies move the legislation and then they reconcile any differences. And it's through the process of reconciliation, if they can come together with a piece of legislation that they can agree upon, then they can do it on a straight majority basis without the 60 vote threshold. And so in order to be able to do that, they, as you said, they have to satisfy certain criteria. And the big criteria there is that they cannot add more than $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. And so because of that rule, they've had to do things like the Senate bill phases in the corporate income tax cut, whereas the House bill would make it start immediately next year. And then they have all these offsetting cuts and things that maybe wouldn't be there but for the need to keep the price tag down. So it's hastily concocted. It's driven by a variety of things, one of which is wanting to get it through on a simple party line, and that means respecting these constraints on how much money they can add to the national debt over time.
Now, that $1.5 trillion number, where does that come from?
Well, there are a lot of different estimates. I think the one that's most often quoted is the $1.5 trillion, and that originally came from the Congressional Budget Office estimate. So that is the the government scorekeeper, if you like, that looks at new legislation and provides estimates of what any major piece of legislation will do to the national debt and to budget deficits projected out over a 10-year horizon.
But what I'm asking is, why is 1.5 trillion deficit increase, deficit, I should say, over the course of 10 years? Why is that okay? As far as what are known as the Byrd rule in the Senate? Why is that number okay?
That's
as
a
opposed
good question.
to
Yeah, why not 1.7 or 1.3 or 2 point? I don't know the answer to that question.
Was that simply just chosen randomly that they were going to allow for that amount of deficit?
Yeah, I'm not a good student of the Byrd rule, so I don't have that historical. My Senate experience was rather limited to a year on the Hill, and I don't know the history of that. But it's a perfectly reasonable thing to wonder about. And I don't know where the 1.5 trillion comes from, to be honest.
So they get this number, and they start cutting willy-nilly certain, I guess, tax breaks, if you will, or they start adding on tax requirements in areas that haven't necessarily traditionally have them. Some may be good. There's some people who make a very strong case, in my opinion, that the mortgage interest deduction is something that we want to roll back. Different people have different ideas about how to do that. What are the most, I guess, problematic of these that you see in this bill?
Oh, well, there are so many, and some of them seem small, but for the individual who suffers the repeal of some exemption that they currently enjoy, it may turn out to be a big thing. I mean, I'd say, I'm an educator, so I'm a professor at a university, and one of the things that people here are very concerned about is this decision to treat as taxable income the tuition waivers, the graduate research stipends and assistantships that we give to students to help them get through graduate school. And if you're talking about, assistantships in the case of the hard sciences, sometimes $30,000 a year, that's a lot of money. And for a student who's not working, who's going to school full time, and they're receiving these tuition waivers, if you suddenly tell them, actually, that we're going to count that as your income and we're going to tax you on that, students are terrified about things like that. So state and local income tax, you mentioned property taxes, that's just one, but right now people can deduct the taxes that they pay at the state level. So there's this SALT, right, provision, and they're talking about eliminating that kind of a deduction. Taxing people on health care coverage that they get. There's just a whole range of deductions that are being lost. Teachers that buy supplies with money out of their own pocket, a first grade teacher who spends a bit of money buying school supplies for her classroom is going to lose the ability to deduct that sort of a thing. So there are lots and lots of things in this.
You mentioned teachers can't deduct when they go out of pocket to provide supplies for their schools. But the good news is, to be fair, that they can deduct some of the expenses associated with their private planes and their private jets.
Which is a benefit, right?
That is a benefit, of course.
So if you have a private jet or you're a company that relies on private jets, you get a tax break.
Well, Stephanie, we'll talk about that more on the other side. I just want to add one more point, too, I should say, about that, about the implications on those PhD and graduate studies. It's going to destroy a lot of graduate programs. It's going to inhibit our science in this country. It's going to inhibit all sorts of professions. It's also likely going to increase the cost of college for undergrads, because these PhD students were teaching undergrads in exchange for a higher education. And so the implications of this are going to ripple throughout not just universities, but also our society in a very, very dramatic way. But we've got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the other side of the ledger. We mentioned private jets. What other benefits are the ultra-rich going to get? And what are the Democrats doing in terms of trying to fight this, at least on a rhetorical basis? And what are they doing wrong? We'll be right back with Stephanie Kelton in a moment. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.